When we think of chronographs, we come to think of the classics such as the Speedy, the Navitimer, the Carrera, the El Primero, the Daytona. And what all of these have in common is that it's almost difficult to think of them without their intended purpose. Chronographs in general have a very rich history, whether it be air travel with the Navitimer or space travel with the Speedmaster, although that was not its intended purpose, or racing with the Carreras and the Daytonas. And within those families of watches, racing chronographs are a quite specific category with very distinguished elements that make them instantly recognizable. And so the watch we have here today is a vintage-inspired chronograph. It's the Depancel Allure Manual Chronograph, and it has all of the essential elements that you'd expect from a classic racing chronograph. The orange stitching, the orange accents are a leitmotif throughout the entire watch. We can see it on the crown, we can see it on the subdials, we can see it on the chrono hand, and it just screams racing. Now, what do I mean by a classic racing chronograph? Wristwatches and racing have a long-standing history and goes as far back as the 50s with the early Hoya watches, later to become Tag Heuer, always very present in Formula One. And because of that, the tachymeter scale obviously in racing is essential because it allows you, or it allowed people back in the day at least, I doubt that there's many people that actually use a tachymeter scale these days. It allows you to measure the speed of an object on a determined distance. But on this watch, we don't only have a tachymeter, we also have a pulsimeter, which allows the wearer to measure their heartbeat. Now, I suggest if you're sitting in a fast car to focus on the road instead of measuring your heartbeat, but it is a real cool feature to have on your watch.
Just a quick intermission. If you're enjoying this video, then please hit the thumbs up. Subscribe if you enjoy our content and leave a thought down below in the comments. We always like to discuss watches. Back to Nele's video.
And although I'm sitting on my 100-pound bike and unfortunately not in a 1960s Targa 911, you can't help but appreciate how this watch comes alive with the passing tarmac in the background. So we have speed, we have heart, and we have passion, central elements of racing, and this watch really does incorporate those. Speaking of details, Depancel didn't cut any corners when it comes to the design of the Allure chronograph. We have beautiful subdials, and also the inner ring of the dial itself makes it appear like a pan pie dial, although it's all relatively flush, but it gives a certain depth to the watch, especially with the black surrounding tachymeter scale. On the back, we have a sapphire crystal, so it's a sapphire sandwich case. We have an open case back that shows us the seagull movement. You know, I like to be direct. If we get a manual chronograph for £575 with this great of detailing all over the watch, obviously the brand has to cut costs somewhere. And in this case, it's obviously with the movement. We have a seagull movement, and that's not a bad thing by any means. It allows us to have a manual wound chronograph with a power reserve of 45 hours at a relatively accessible price, and it allows Depancel to focus on the actual design and finishing of the watch with having still a respectable chronograph movement that we know works well because it's been used in the industry over and over again. And I see the chronograph complication as one of the most accessible complex complications. I think people often brush over chronographs as if they were a simple complication because they are so accessible when we look at the market. But actually within the lower, I'd say the lower tier of complications, you know, obviously we cannot compare it to a perpetual calendar, but in the bigger scheme of things, a chronograph is still relatively complex. But the more complex the complication, the more expensive it gets to have that complication in a mechanical timepiece. So what are we actually getting? We have a 39mm case, which I love. It's definitely not big on the wrist. It sits just nicely. I have about a 16cm circumference wrist, so it sits very nicely. It is a little bit thick with 13mm, but that's also the impression because the watch is a bit smaller. Now, I would have preferred a standard buckle on this watch because the deployant clasp, although nicely finished, also with details of the logo, does add a little bit extra thickness. So I would have gone probably with another strap option there, but that's easy to address as we have a lug width of 20mm. And overall, again, it's a very sporty look. It's a high contrasting dial, and the attention to detail on all the other elements of the watch are there. Even on the strap, we have this small French flag, which I think is a nice touch. And we also have a quick release on the strap. Again, easy to exchange. Depancel also didn't really cut any corners when it comes to the packaging of the watch, which I guess people sometimes they brush over it, but you know, that's your first encounter with the watch that you just bought, and I think it's really nicely packaged. Really intrigued to know what you think of the watch, and if you want to know anything more about it, I left a link in the description, so check it out. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time. Ciao.